In today's video, I will be doing a flip through of my Commonplace book. I haven't done that yet, and I'm also not done with my Commonplace book. The notebook is still yet to be finished, but I figured it would be a good time to show you everything I've done in it so far. So, I'll be going over these briefly. Not every single quote will be read, but just an overview. Okay, starting off in the very first page, I started this notebook in October of 2025, and I'm probably a little less than halfway through with the whole notebook. So I'm not doing these every day, but pretty frequently. To start here, I had just watched the movie Mary Shelley, and it made me want to revisit Frankenstein, which I remember reading in high school, and I really loved it. That's what this entry is about, the movie, and then also Mary Shelley, the author. And fun fact about Mary Shelley, or maybe not fun, but slightly disturbing, I was looking into her for this entry, and I found out that she kept her husband's heart after he died. It was like a calcified heart, and so yeah, she kept Percy Shelley's heart with her. But that's so very Mary Shelley. That tracks, honestly. Next entry, this one was about relationships. I was seeing Dr. Orna a lot on YouTube. The show Couples Therapy was popping up a lot for me, and so I ended up watching a lot of videos from Dr. Orna because I think her philosophy and just her way of doing couples therapy was really interesting. This one was about Susan Sontag. I had started reading Reborn by Susan Sontag, and these quotes were from the intro, and I believe her daughter wrote this intro about her. And I like this quote in particular. It's a quote that Susan Sontag herself approved of, and I believe the person who originally said this was Elias Canetti, but Susan Sontag was a serious person, and she related to this quote, and I also related to this quote too. And this entry is about connections and the ability to connect ideas, things, and even accidentally making these connections and noticing patterns. Like this quote right here makes me laugh. The most fun a girl can have is finding parallels, noticing patterns, making connections, contemplating. And then this meme, a girl having the time of her life, which so true. This one was a really good quote, but it's very long, so I won't read it. But it's from one of my favorite books ever, which is Madness, Rack, and Honey. And I do have a lot of quotes from that book in my Commonplace book because there's just so many brilliant lines in it. Next one is about creativity and motherhood. I remember looking into Georgia O'Keeffe, specifically because she never had children, and that resonated with me because I'm someone who does not want to have children. And I was ruminating on the fact that Georgia O'Keeffe picked her work or her creativity over motherhood in a way. Like this quote right here, it says, "The intellect of man is forced to choose perfection of the life or of the work." And that quote stuck with me. And not work in the 9-to-5 job kind of sense, but the work that you feel called to do, the reason you're put onto this earth. So yeah, mostly just contemplating on this idea. And this entry here is about legacy and the fact that brands who have a legacy can charge more for their products and people will still buy them and actually will happily buy these products if they have a legacy behind them. And the quote here says, "You can perfectly imitate a Louis Vuitton bag, but you can't sell it for $6,000 because you don't have the heritage. As long as you can convince users the past is relevant, they'll pay billions for it." I thought that was interesting, especially with fountain pens because fountain pens are very expensive and they do lean on that legacy. So even though I know my Sailor pens and my Pilot pens, they're all very expensive and probably overpriced, I still buy them because of that legacy. So yeah. Next entry is about meritocracy, and I was watching a video from Elaine the Botan. I don't know how you say his name, but he has some really interesting quotes. I don't agree with all of his takes, but he does have some interesting ideas. And this one mostly focused on how the ancient Romans and the Greeks viewed meritocracy versus how we view it today. And so a part of this quote says, "Most societies for most periods of history have believed that any achievement is a combination of individual effort and divine intervention." Oh, and this is a good quote too, I should read this. "You know, the Greeks are obsessed by hubris, by the concept of forgetting the role of divine intervention. That's the definition of hubris, in other words, thinking that you are the master of your fate. That is what, all Greek legends, histories are all about. It's only ever about human arrogance, so clearly they were tempted by this. We've gone hook, line, and sinker for this temptation." And then my personal thoughts here. As I said, I don't believe in meritocracy, not with privilege and nepotism existing, and so forth. So reflecting on meritocracy here. This entry is about Cleopatra. I had just watched the documentary on Hulu, I think it was, Cleopatra's Final Secret, and it was a really informative documentary on Cleopatra, and so this was just basically recapping what I had watched and the stories I had learned from that documentary. And so mostly this documentary revolves around Kathleen Martinez, who is the woman behind finding Cleopatra's burial site, or what they think is the burial site. They haven't found it yet, but they are getting closer to finding it, and they're finding more clues. And so this picture right here actually is Cleopatra's portrait, and it's the 8th known depiction of it uncovered. And so there aren't very many Cleopatra portraits or depictions of her because the Romans had that all destroyed. They didn't want any evidence of Cleopatra to exist. But this was uncovered at a temple, which I think is interesting. So this entry is reflecting on why I journal, and I think Joan Didion had a great view on this. And she said, "Had I been blessed with even limited access to my own mind, there would have been no reason to write. I write entirely to find out what I'm thinking, what I'm looking at, what I see and what it means, what I want and what I fear." And also Susan Sontag also had a great quote here. She says, "In the journal, I do not just express myself more openly than I could to any person. I create myself." And I really resonated with both of these because I feel like I do create myself in these journals. I'm collecting all of my interests, and this book feels like a recreation of me. And then this next entry was about the Louvre heist. This had just happened, and so it was fresh on my mind, and it was in the news everywhere. And I love a good white-collar crime. I love some museum heists. The whole concept of it was super intriguing. So I wrote about it, and also past heists as well. And if you didn't know, back in 1911, the Mona Lisa was stolen. So it's definitely not the Louvre's first heist. There's been quite a few. That was this entry. This one was about my ancestry. Ancestry.com did like a huge update to the European regions, and so I finally got a more detailed breakdown of my European heritage. And this entry is about Pompeii, and I had just watched a documentary, and I can't remember which one, but it had talked about this specific plaster cast, and I was curious about it, so I looked into it more. And then I found a academic journal talking about the actual identities of these, not that who they were as people, but likely their gender and if they were related to one another. It was often thought that this was a mother and child, but it actually is not a mother and child. It's a guy and a child, and they are not related. So interesting information about the whole Pompeii plaster casts and how they were made even. And this entry, since rediscovering my Basque ancestry, I decided to look into mythologies from this area more, since I'm not really familiar with Basque culture. So that was just looking into Mari, the goddess, and she is the goddess of storms and intensely identified with lightning. She also provides accurate oracles, and she can produce miracles of healing, fertility, rescue, and protection. And this entry here, this is the only entry in my whole Commonplace book where I don't have any pictures. I think I had just got my typewriter, and so I wanted to use my typewriter. And so these are quotes from this book that I was reading, A Little Larger Than the Entire Universe by Fernando Pessoa. And this was one of his alter egos. I don't remember what he calls them. It starts with an H. It's not a pseudonym, but he writes under different personalities, and this was his alter ego, Alberto Jose Cairo. But I really love these quotes in particular from this book, and I'm still trying to finish this book. It's got a lot of really great poems in it. This quote in particular is talking about nature, and this one is talking about death and just acceptance. Maybe I'll read this one because I really love this one. "When spring arrives, if I'm already dead, the flowers will flower in the same way, and the trees will not be less green than last spring. Reality doesn't need me. It makes me enormously happy to think that my death is of no importance whatsoever. You can pray in Latin over my coffin if you like. If you like, you can sing and dance in a circle around it. I have no preferences for when I can no longer have preferences. What will be, when it is what it will be when it is." It makes me happy, too, to think that my death is of no importance whatsoever. It makes it so much easier to live right now. Maybe some of you don't feel that way, but I feel that way. Next entry. This one's about astrology and Pluto in Aquarius. And basically, whenever Pluto is in Aquarius is when we see massive humanitarian revolution and just the history behind when we've seen these two things line up, like the French Revolution and the American Revolution both started the last time Pluto was in Aquarius. And just recently, Pluto went into Aquarius. So I wonder if there's going to be massive humanitarian revolution here soon. This entry was when I had just watched the movie The Last Showgirl. Oh, this movie broke my heart. Pamela was such an amazing actress in this. But I was recapping the movie here and pondering on what this movie ponders on, which is beauty in youth as currency. And when you no longer have that currency, what does your life look like? When you don't have beauty or you don't have youth, what is your worth? What is your purpose? And so that's what this is here. This subject was about trinkets, and so these stickers are actually marker drawings that I had drawn. And what sparked it was this quote here, and it's from the Book of Disquiet by Fernando Pessoa. And I'll read you a part of it here. "The buyers of useless things are always wiser than they think. They are buying small dreams." And I love that. That's such a wonderful way to think of people who buy trinkets. And this entry is about the Renaissance. I was reading the book Inventing the Renaissance by Ada Palmer. Some very interesting information in this book. For some reason, when I think of the Renaissance, I think of great things. I think of achievements and accomplishments and just society flourishing. But that wasn't the case at all. I'll read you a couple of these quotes here. The first one is, "The Renaissance was like the Wizard of Oz, great and terrible, and desperate for us not to look behind the curtain." And I'll read you this one here. "But isn't the Renaissance supposed to be a golden age? And the origin of so much modernity is proud of individualism, the rational exploration of nature in our world, the glittering masterpieces we admire in museums. Yet for those living through it, this famous era felt so desperate one could barely hope the future might forgive its failures. How can both be true at once?" And this book goes over the fact that the Renaissance was hell to live through. It wasn't a great time at all to be alive in. Yet we got all of these beautiful paintings and ideas and just advancements in this time. But we, now in the future, don't look back on it like it was terrible. We look back on it fondly. And I was pondering on this because I saw a lot of parallels to our current society. And next entry, the subject is about the Appalachians, and specifically about how the Appalachians were part of Pangaea. And so Pangaea is basically the idea that all the continents were conjoined at one point, and slowly over time it broke apart. And this entry was about Hermes, or Hermes, depending on how you say it. I forgot why I wanted to look into Hermes more for this entry, but he is one of my favorites, of the Greek gods anyway. "He was Zeus's messenger who flies as fleet as thought to do his bidding. Of all the gods, he was the shrewdest and most cunning. In fact, he was a master thief who started upon his career before he was a day old. He was god of commerce and the market, protector of traders. In odd contrast to this idea of him, he was also the solemn guide of the dead, the divine herald who led the souls down to their last home." And I love this dichotomy of him being a trickster, being mischievous, while also having a very serious side to him. And so this entry is The Heroine's Journey. I was reading The Heroine's Journey by Maureen Murdoch, and this is the flip side of The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell. And I believe Maureen Murdoch said she was a student of Joseph Campbell, and she didn't like the fact that The Hero's Journey was centered around men and how women had different journeys. And so this is the journey that Maureen Murdoch thinks that women go through. And I did relate to this one. I personally went through this journey as well. Next entry is about enchantment. So I was reading The Enchantment of Modern Life by Jane Bennett. And I wrote this down because I adored the way that this author thought of the world and her viewpoint aligned with my own. I didn't finish the book and I still need to finish it, but the part that I read I really loved. And here's a quote from it. "It claims both that the contemporary world retains the power to enchant humans, and that humans can cultivate themselves so as to experience more of that effect. Enchantment is something that we encounter, that hits us, but it is also a component that can be fostered through deliberate strategies. One of those strategies might be to give greater expression to the sense of play, another to hone sensory receptivity to the marvelous specificity of things. Yet another way to enhance the enchantment effect is to resist the story of the disenchantment of modernity." I agree that enchantment can be fostered within us with play. This is the first time I had really seen enchantment used in this way, and I really love the way she thinks in this book. Next entry is from a book I was reading, The Bookmakers, and the book is about making books. It talks about the history of printing books. So if you love books about books, this is a great one to read. This entry is about the last penny. So it was around this time when the last penny was made at the mint, and so I wrote about it here. Very sad for the penny. And this entry was about taste. I really love this quote here. Maybe I'll read this one. It says, "Maybe our soul does live for the most part outside of our body. Maybe it drifts between centuries, is in love with the strident yellowed curve of a bullhorn from archaic Crete. Maybe enamored with tapestries hung in the courtly schools of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Don't brush your tastes away. Take your delight seriously. You could reach out towards historical figures, cloud formations, and badger tracks in the snow. Claim them as familial instructors. They have a kind of warmth attached." And this entry here is about curiosity, and it got a lot of traction on social media for some reason. And so the whole theme of this entry was about being curious and going down rabbit holes and fostering curiosity. Here's a good quote from it. "Curiosity is voracious. The more you know, the more you want to know. The more connections you make between the different bits of knowledge, the more ideas you have, which is why curiosity is really the wellspring of creativity." And I really agree with that quote. And this entry is about attention. And of course, I had to do the Mary Oliver quote, "Attention is the beginning of devotion." Just talking about attention here. And this entry is about the brain and how our brain rewires itself and how we are changed based on the experiences that we have. And it also goes into the specifics on how that works in the brain. And this quote here at the end one says, "This is inspirational, I suppose, because it means that each of us is truly unique, not just in our genetic makeup, but even in the way our brains change over time." This entry was about the blue stockings. I'd actually never heard of them before this entry. I stumbled upon the topic in an academic journal. I was looking up something else and I found information about the blue stockings, so I looked into them further, and this entry explores who they were. This was kind of like the first women's book club, where they got together and talked about books and education and society, and that was radical for this time because women weren't very well read because they weren't allowed to be well read, and the women were mostly well-off women. So, interesting group of women. This entry is about writing, and I'm quoting Rainer Maria Rilke here, and also one of my favorite books ever, Ahead of All Parting by Rainer Maria Rilke. I can't remember if this was a poem or prose. I have to read you the beginning part because I love this. Poems amount to so little when you write them too early in your life. You ought to wait and gather sense and sweetness for a whole lifetime, and a long one if possible, and then, at the very end, you might perhaps be able to write 10 good lines." Rilke was being cheeky here, but I love that. And it's just a quote on writing, specifically writing poetry. And Rilke wrote way more than 10 good lines in his lifetime. He's one of my favorite poets. And this entry is about cycles, and that's why I have all these circle and spiral motifs everywhere. But it's about how cycles repeat themselves, but they also never repeat themselves perfectly or exactly the same. And I'll read you the end quote here. "The spinning of each day is different each time she turns. Each circumambulation around the sun is a different year that unfolds, each cycle of spring, of summer, of autumn, of winter. And the seasons that exist within the liminal space between those seasons never repeat themselves exactly. It's constantly in variation because a cycle repeats itself anew each time." This kind of reminds me of that song lyric from Rush. The more that things change, the more they stay the same. I like the idea of cycles and repetition. And this entry was about murmuration. I forgot why. I had seen this recently when I wrote this, and I was curious about it, and I wanted to learn more about murmuration, which is when birds fly in sync in the same motion and they create these beautiful patterns in the sky. I've always wondered how they orchestrate their movements, and this explains it here. And so this entry is about influences, and specifically about finding and keeping influences and how that is active work. And so when you're looking to be influenced by writers of the past, you'll be rewarded with their wisdom. And this entry here is about goals, and specifically it's about the letter that Hunter S. Thompson wrote to his friend Hume Logan. And it's about setting goals and just goals as a concept. And it was December when I wrote this, and so I had goals for the new year 2026 in mind when I wrote this. And next entry is about astronomy, and specifically these two quotes came from the book The Wheeling Year by Ted Kooser, and I love these two quotes. It's about space, but also how I feel so small in comparison to the universe, and how that thought is so comforting to me. This quote here, I'll read you this because I love this one so much. When at last the light from the next galaxy arrives, or what is left of it arrives, it is only a speck, the pinpoint center of what was once an enormous snowball of light, come rolling down the black tar paper roof of the universe, losing itself all the way. 900,000 years of loss, only enough left of it to light one facet of a grain of sand, here at the edge of a quick stop parking lot in Omaha. Like, that's such a miraculous series of events just to get some light on a little grain of sand at a quick stop parking lot. And it just goes to show how miraculous it is to even exist. Love that book. Also, Ted Kooser is a great poet. I love his work. And this entry is about death, and this came from Ahead of All Parting by Rainer Maria Rilke. I do tend to do multiple pages on the same book, but I separate things out based on subject. Like, this one was about death, and the other one was... What was the other one? Oh, this one was about on writing. So 2 different subjects, but I do like to separate them and also reuse the same source over and over, especially when there's a lot of good nuggets of wisdom in it. And so this quote here is obviously about death, but I'll read this part here. And being dead is hard work and full of retrieval before one can gradually feel a trace of eternity. It goes over letting go of everything you learned as a human, letting go of your name, of who you are, in order to embrace eternity, essentially. Not that I'm religious, but I think that was an interesting line, that being dead is hard work. So yeah, very interesting quote, very long though, or else I'd read the whole thing. And this entry is about history, and I was pondering from these quotes how history can be free from bias and entirely factual when the person recording had their own biases. And spoiler alert, history really can't be unbiased, and this reminds me of this quote that I wrote here I got from the Cleopatra documentary. It says, "We have to remember, history is written by the victors." And so, with history being written by the victors, it's not necessarily factual, it's just whoever had the last say. So that's what I was contemplating here. This one is about adaptations. The fact that if the film isn't faithful to the book, then it's considered bad. But also when things are loosely based on something, it's bad if you don't list that credit. And so it's trying to find the line between crediting the original work, but also, deriving your own viewpoint from that original work. And this entry is about aesthetic and how everyone has their own. And I'll read this quote because it sums up this page better than I could say it. "My view remains that one is not born an artist or with a talent for drawing. That is down to education. But that we come into the world with the potential for a highly developed aesthetic sense, and we have an urge to adapt our environment and accoutrements accordingly. What is intriguing is why we consider some things to be beautiful or interesting, and other things not, why we even have a concept of art or an aesthetic sense. So, in some ways, aesthetic is inherent to us, but also something that can be developed." This entry is about illuminated manuscripts. I was really getting into this rabbit hole of looking up illuminated manuscripts, and I still to this day want to make one of my own. I think they're so stunning, but I'm still learning Gothic lettering. It's something I'm practicing. But yeah, this entry is about the history and the way that illuminated manuscripts were made. And this entry is about reading and why we even read. It's basically a love letter to reading. And it's from the book Madness, Rack, and Honey, per usual. I love that book. But yeah, just basically sums up why I love reading. A great quote, but a little too long for me to read. And this one, you've seen me go over this here on my YouTube channel, but this one is about artistic styles and how our styles are inherent to who we are and where we're from. And this entry is about prosody, and I remember looking this up and wanting to learn more information because I saw a video of a teacher who was sharing that a lot of our young students struggle with prosody, which is basically like the pattern or the stress or intonation of language. And so when I'm reading you these quotes, knowing where to put the emphasis on these words, that's prosody. I suppose it's not really an inherent quality, it's something that's learned. So that is what this is about. And this entry you've also seen me do the whole video on, and I read the entire quote. But this one is about cochineal red, which is a specific type of red dye that comes from crushed bugs. This entry is about rereading and also from Madness, Rack, and Honey. Previously, I never liked to reread things. I never liked to rewatch things. But in recent years, I've found that I love to revisit the things that bring me comfort. And so that's what this is about. It's specifically rereading. This entry is about fairy tales and why fairy tales matter, how it's a very important part of child development, and how important it is for children to read, especially fairy tales. And this entry was a little more abstract. This one is about language and just contemplating language isn't intrinsically human. It's not something that humans do by nature. It is something that has been societal. It's been conditioned by society. I write here, if my every thought is shaped by a language I did not invent, that isn't intrinsically human but rather societal, every thought I've ever had is not mine, nor is it unique, and is shaped by people I will never know. So yeah, that's part of my reflection here. And this entry is about habitualization, and I'll read you this quote here because that's the easiest way to describe it. Shklovsky describes how, as we go through our daily lives, our perceptions of things become habitual and automatic. We start to lose the sense of the actuality of things and treat them as abstractions. Basically, we get so used to seeing things as they are that we don't really see them as they are anymore. And that poetry and art make things feel strange so that we can see them anew. We can see things in a new light. And this quote here came from the book Why Poetry by Matthew Zapruder. And this one, another entry on connection, and I'll read you the quote from this one. The best moments in reading are when you come across something, a thought, a feeling, a way of looking at things that you thought special, particular to you. And here it is, set down by someone else, a person you've never met, maybe even someone long dead, and it's as if a hand has come out and taken yours. I love those experiences when I read or experience art in some way that I feel seen and I relate to the author, and it's as if the author could have plucked that right out of my head. I love those moments, and that's what this entry is on. This entry is about fire and man, and specifically how fire contributed to the evolution of humans, and that humans would have never survived as a species if it wasn't for fire. And that was mankind's basically greatest invention, was fire. This entry is about anonymous female poets, and you saw this sticker before from my sticker video, but the entry talks about the myth of anonymous female poets. There's this idea that women didn't attribute their names to works that they wrote, or they wrote under male pseudonyms, or that they hid their identity altogether in fear of being seen as a woman. That's not the case at all. And also it speaks to how we have kind of erased female poets and female writers from the literary canon. And that's not indicative of their time, but rather indicative of ours, that we erased it, not them. And this entry is about Oscar Wilde. He is one of my favorite authors. I remember reading his work for the first time in high school and fell in love with it. I think The Importance of Being Earnest was the very first one I read. And I loved his wit and just his way of seeing the world. But surprisingly, I didn't really know much about Oscar Wilde. I mean, I had known that he died. He went to prison and died shortly after. That was the extent of it. But I didn't really know the specifics of it. And so for this entry, I looked into his life more. This entry is about komorebi, which is the way that light filters through leaves and creates this pretty dappled light of leaves. And this quote speaks about what it is. And this entry actually came about because of this artwork here. I stumbled across this accidentally when I was looking for some artwork for a different entry, but I was so intrigued by this when I saw it. I'm like, what is that? So this entry is looking into it further, and this is actually a Mickey Mouse Kachina. And in Pueblo mythology, Kachinas are spirit beings that act as intermediaries between humans and deities. And I thought it was interesting that Mickey Mouse was such a cultural phenomenon that it even leaked its way into Hopi culture. Next entry is about Esperanto, which is a universal language that was invented by a Polish doctor, and it was an attempt to get everyone in the world to speak the same language, and this is the alphabet from it. And people do still speak it today, but very, very few people. But it didn't stick, obviously, since hardly anyone speaks it, but I thought it was interesting. And this subject here, this was right before Valentine's Day, so subject was about love, and it's from Ahead of All Parting by Rilke. And this poem is beautiful. I'll read this since it's short. Again and again, however, we know the landscape of love and the little churchyard there with its sorrowing names and the frighteningly silent abyss into which the others fall. Again and again the two of us walk out together under the ancient trees, lie down again and again among the flowers, face to face with the sky. Love that poem. This entry is about taste, and I quote an essay. I actually did another Commonplace book entry, and you saw me do this one. The one about artistic styles. Well, I used a quote from that same essay, and here is that quote. Even if someone paints a green sun, I will not say it is wrong. This is because there may be a time when the sun looks that way to me too. Simply because a painting has a green sun in it, I will not be able to overlook the overall value of the painting. The good or bad of the painting has nothing to do with whether the sun is green or flaming scarlet. And basically the whole thing is just about personal taste. And this one, I had just read the book Ways of Seeing by John Berger. I wanted to write about it here. This one is specifically about the European nude. And an essay in this book argues that oil nudes are the first objectification of women. They were not to praise or worship, but rather to possess women. And this entry is about art history, and it came from the book Ways of Seeing by John Berger. Again, another quote from that book. And it's talking about mediocre works being in museums next to masterpieces, and how there's no differentiation in museums to distinguish what's a masterpiece and what is just a painting that a painter did to make some money. And I wonder if there does need to be a distinction between it, but I thought this author's viewpoint on it was interesting. This entry is about imitation, and this quote probably sums it up best. It's impossible to imitate another artist's point of view. We can only swim in the same waters. But basically these quotes talk about copying other artists and creatives, and how that process of copying can lead to finding your own style, and how important it is to find your own style and not stay imitating forever. This entry is about Venus, which you also saw me make on this channel, and specifically this quote here is about how she came to look this way, how we always see her depicted in this way because of Italian painters, the Italian Renaissance. And this entry is about melancholy, and specifically it's quoting the poem Having It Out with Melancholy, and it's a very beautiful poem. It's too long for me to read. This even is a small portion of it, but it's a beautiful poem. You should read it. This one you also saw me do a video on recently. It's about plants and native ways of knowing, and how humans are the younger brother of creation. This entry is about history, and it's reflecting on what people in the future will think of our current time, because right now when we look at the past, we view them so differently. They used to burn witches at the stake, and we don't do that anymore, and that's honestly insane. And so the author wonders what the future will look back on us and think, how did they believe that? That's what this is reflecting on. This entry is about light, and how we use light so frequently in metaphors like light at the end of the tunnel, light bulb moment. We're so focused on light that we don't look at ourselves in the dark much, and not literally but metaphorically. And this talks about suppressing our darkness and how that is a detrimental thing to us, avoiding our negative feelings. And this quote here kind of sums it up. In the dark, though, we look fully human. It's about seeing ourselves entirely, including our darkness, as a full person, not just focusing on the good parts. This entry is about life. Specifically, this quote here is talking about the author's experience of holding an octopus as it was dying. And when I read this for the first time, it made me cry, but it's a great quote. It's from the book World of Wonders. And last one. This one is about poetry and the purpose of poetry. And specifically, I'm quoting a poem called Ars Poetica by Czesław Miłosz. And I only wrote a couple of stanzas from the poem, but I do love these two stanzas, so I'll share them with you here. In the very essence of poetry, there is something indecent. A thing is brought forth which we didn't know we had in us. So we blink our eyes as if a tiger had sprung out and stood in the light, lashing his tail. The purpose of poetry is to remind us how difficult it is to remain just one person. For our house is open, there are no keys in the doors, and invisible guests come in and out at will. I thought that was beautiful. And so yeah, that is my Commonplace book summed up. Wow, I didn't expect to chat for that long. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for watching.